Shalom. Welcome to Light to the Nations, Hilchot Beit HaBechira. We've been studying in the Rambam's Laws of the Chosen House. We've now begun Chapter 5, Halacha 1, where we left off rather abruptly in our last lesson in the middle of Halacha Aleph. We're learning a great deal now in detail about the construction, structure of the Temple Mount, and so far we've discussed just the beginning or halfway through this halacha, bearing in mind again the Temple Mount called Mount Moriah and called Har Habayit, and we discussed in our last lesson some of the beautiful reasons behind these expressions. And the Temple Mount is considered to be the largest man-made plateau in the world. This is the location of the Holy Temple, the sanctified area of the Holy Temple, according to the Mishnah and Tractate Midot, which the Rambam here codifies really as halacha, 500 amma by 500 amma. And those who are familiar today with the Temple Mount and who follow the work of the Temple Institute are aware of the fact that the present day layout of the Temple Mount complex is much larger, 4, perhaps closer to 5 times the size described by the Mishnah, because of the additions that were made throughout history. And of course, this concept leads to a great deal of confusion in the world of scholarship and in the world of religion, as it were. And perhaps more than anything else, the confusion regarding the dimensions of the Holy Temple are what leads to the lack of interest in some quarters regarding the ascent to the Temple Mount. Those people who are afraid of treading in the wrong area claim that because we don't know exactly where the temple stood, they're afraid that if they will be going up, they might, God forbid, be going on the actual sanctified area of the temple, which is a prohibition. And this is another story altogether. Suffice it to say, in the meantime, what we're learning about here is the original sanctified dimensions of the Temple Mount. And today, the mountain, as we are familiar with it, is much, much larger because of additions that were made throughout history that did not have the sanctity aspect, that did not have legally binding sanctity, didn't change, therefore, those parameters of the Temple Mount. And so that's an important thing to bear in mind. So we have this confusion today in the contemporary world as far as exactly where the temple stood. This, of course, has to do with the other concept of different opinions regarding these 500 cubits by 500 cubits. Where on the mountain did the temple stand? This also is another issue that we have addressed as well. One of the things that we mentioned so far, as we read the words of the Rambam, and let's look again at Halacha Aleph, we read Har Habayit v'hu Har HaMoriah, the Temple Mount, which is Mount Moriah. Haya 500 amma al 500 amma, was 500 cubits by 500 cubits. V'haya mukaf chuma, was surrounded by a wall. And this is really what we began to discuss in great detail in our last lesson. V'chefin al gabe chefin hayu bnuyot mitachtav mipnei oel hatuma. We began to discuss this unique concept that the structure of the Temple Mount, the topography of the Temple Mount, the very earth itself, the bowels subterraneously of the Temple Mount were hollowed out and were formed in a pattern of arches, of domed arches, because of what's called Ohel Hatuma. Ohel Hatuma is a concept in Halacha, which we described again in our last lesson, a little bit the complexity of it. We discussed a little bit of the ideas behind it on a philosophical level, but the concept basically is, if I can put it very simply, succinctly, there is an idea that anything in a structure, anything in a tent, and this is the expression oil tuma, together with a corpse becomes defiled by the presence of the corpse. And the idea here is that even though the corpse may be buried, the impurity can be contracted, it can rise up. However, if there's a vacant space between the dead body and the earth above it, that prevents the ascent of Tuma. So, the Mishnah, actually in Tractate Para, we're going to discuss this in a moment, discusses the idea that the Temple Mount was actually hollowed out from within in order to prevent the rise of ritual impurity. In other words, if there might be a possibility of some unknown grave underneath the Temple Mount, the entire earth below the Temple Mount was hollowed out so that there would be this space, kind of like a spiritual shock absorber that would not allow the Tuma to rise up. And again, taken in a vacuum, these halachot sound very odd to the untrained ear. This is actually a specialty area of study, even within the complex world of the traditions of the Torah. Again, as we mentioned, these are things that, when we're not in a context of the temple, these are things that lose their meaning, lose their context. Whenever we have a discussion regarding the temple, the centrality of the temple, life in the time of the temple, all of these halachot have a tremendous amount of meaning. The whole concept of the temple is that it brings about this spiritual balance. Because of the presence of the Shekhinah, the Kohanim who are serving in the temple are instructed to always maintain a very high standard of separatedness, of being away from anything that could bring about a misalignment for them spiritually, which is really the core concept of what these tahara and tuma, purity and the lack of purity, are really all about. And as I mentioned, there are other areas of Jewish life and law today that are affected by these halachot, which are much easier to deal with. They have to do with mikvah and immersion in water. But in the time of the temple, the concept of tumat mit, of the impurity caused by exposure to death, is very, very severe. And as we learn, the only antidote to tumat mit, to the impurity caused by exposure to death, is the sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer, as described in Bamidbar, in the 19th chapter of the book of Numbers. For those that are just joining us now, on the Temple Institute website at www.templeinstitute.org, there is a link called Red Heifer, and there is a tremendous amount of information online regarding the entire concept of the Para Aduma, the red heifer. So in Tractate Para, which is the section of the Mishnah that talks about all of the complex regulations regarding the red heifer, in the 3rd chapter, there is a very unusual thing described regarding the process by which a new red heifer was processed, because there is a certain conundrum, a certain logical paradox as to how one would be able to prepare a new red heifer. And there in Tractate Para, there is a listing of all of the red heifers which existed throughout Jewish history, from the original red heifer that was prepared by Moses himself, who received the commandments, until the close of the Second Temple period. There were only 9 red heifers, and there we have the famous tradition that the 10th red heifer will be prepared by the Messiah, and the whole concept of what Maimonides discusses there in his commentary of the Mishnah. But in order to prepare a red heifer, in order to slaughter it and burn it and prepare the ashes, one has to be pure in order to do that. Now, how could a person be pure if everyone in our day and age has been exposed to death? So the Mishnah in Tractate Para discusses the fact that in Jerusalem, in the time of the temple, there were very unique complexes, special courtyards. This is the language of the Mishnah. Chatzerot hayu b'Yerushalayim. There were these unique courtyards in Jerusalem, which were constructed in exactly the fashion that Maimonides discusses here regarding the Temple Mount. That these courtyards were hollowed out underneath. And there are other details also as far as a certain amount of vacant space that has to be, and the arches. And they were also, as an extra precaution, they were also built on top of bedrock, where we could be certain that nothing was ever located under there. In other words, it wouldn't really be possible for there to be an unknown grave under there. But in general, besides that, other precautions were taken as far as it being hollowed out. And so what was done with these special courtyards? The righteous women of the priesthood, the wives of Kohanim, would come into these complexes, and they were fully equipped for living. They were entire neighborhoods that were built in these special courtyards. And the women of the Kohanim would actually stay in these courtyards and give birth to young Kohanim, priests, in these courtyards. And again, these were completely set up for life with every sort of aspect of society, homes and schooling, and etc., etc. And they stayed within this area until the children were old enough to go out and perform the duties of preparing the red heifer. So that, in other words, by giving birth to a new generation in this area, which was by merit of its unique construction according to these guidelines, these areas were protected from the penetration of impurity. And this is a very, very remarkable concept. They were insulated spiritually by the very fact that they were built the way they were built, with the protection, the buffer of the hollowed out subterranean level. They were protected from the rise of any impurity from an unknown source of death, which is called kever hatahom. Kever hatahom means some sort of grave which is unknown to us in the deep of the earth. So this is the process that's described in Tractate Para. You can read more about it, as I mentioned, at the link for the Temple Institute, where we have a great deal about this in detail and illustrations as well, some of which you are seeing now. And this, perhaps, in the entire literature of the Mishnah, is one of the clearest descriptions of this type of construction, of architecture, of topography, that's described here by the Rambam. Now, when it comes to the bridge that we have already seen that connects between the eastern gate of the Temple Mount and Har HaMishcha, as we described, the Mount of Anointment, the location on the Mount of Olives where the red heifer was prepared, there we are taught, also in this Tractate Para, that that bridge was built with this system of arches. Now, I'm telling you all this to point out something actually that's very, very interesting. Again, this is an opportunity to remind us that the Rambam, what he really accomplished in general with his seminal work, Mishnah Torah, which we are studying, the laws of the temple in Mishnah Torah, the Rambam really went through the entire spectrum of the Talmud, the Mishnah and the Gemara, and all of the order of the oral tradition and all of the clarifications that the sages made in the Gemara. And the Rambam distilled all of this for practical Jewish law, as if he was going through all of the annals and all of the records of the study hall, and going through all of the different opinions and rendering something on a silver platter for us for practical life. This is what he did. And this is why I've mentioned on many occasions today as well, that such and such, that the Rambam says that this particular halakha is based on such and such a Mishnah. Because this is really the source of many, but not all, of the Rambam's writings come from the Mishnah, but he's putting it into a very practical order. So what do I want to point out here? In Tractate Para, we learn there that the Temple Mount and the courtyards of the temple were hollowed out underneath because of this concept of the desire to prevent impurity from rising. However, there in Tractate Para, it actually does not tell us what type of hollowing out this was. In other words, the Rambam here tells us in his own words that the system that you have seen of the arches that we're so familiar with in the illustration of the bridge, the famous bridge that connected from the eastern gate to the Mount of Anointment, and as well as the type of arches that were used in the courtyards that are described in Tractate Para regarding the children of the Kohanim who were born there. the Rambam tells us here as well, as we've said, v'kefen al gabi kefen hayu b'niyot mitachtav mipnei ohel hatumah, that the innards underneath the Temple Mount was built in a series of arches in order to protect from the rise of Tumah. But actually, we do not find that expression in the Mishnah. The Mishnah only tells us that the innards of the Temple Mount were hollowed, does not tell us how that was done, or, in fact, that the system of arches was used. So, basically, other commentaries tell us that the Rambam deduced this, that this is his conjecture, that this is his opinion, based on the concept that was in use with the bridge. And this is his actual position regarding the Temple Mount as well, even though it doesn't really state that specifically in the Mishnah itself. All the Mishnah tells us about is the vacant space. So the concept of the construction of arches, which was used regarding the ramp that leads from the Temple Mount to the Har HaMishcha, the Mount of Anointment on the Mount of Olives, this is something which the Rambam feels safe to say that we can assume was used underneath the Temple Mount as well, the same technique. But just for this point of clarification, which is very important as far as the tradition is concerned, the only actual thing that we know from the Mishnah itself is the fact that the Temple Mount was hollowed out. So this is about as much as we will discuss this particular concept for now. I feel a bit, perhaps, that we haven't really done this justice, but it would be very difficult under these circumstances in this particular format to describe these things in more detail. Again, first glance perhaps, or first exposure, these are difficult halachot. Even very learned people that are more professional, as it were, in their approach to Torah study are very stumped by some of these halachot, which frankly have become in our time a specialty type of area of knowledge, especially because of the fact that, unfortunately, since the concept of the temple doesn't seem actual to so many people, it really has not been fully investigated, and there's a great deal of misinformation about how all of this works. But all of these halachot extremely important, extremely pertinent, and of course timeless, regarding Hashem's plan for the world, for Israel, for the building of the temple, and important also to note, because there are many people who unfortunately still view a lot of the emphasis on Jewish law, on halakha, which is more properly called biblical law. People tend to regard this, and I hate to even give credence to this expression, but they refer to it as legalistic, as if there is something, some sort of disadvantage or something negative about the fact that Hashem gave over the world of halakha for His world, the world that He seeks to have an abode in, and as if this is something which one can be elevated above or graduate above. And of course, the furthest thing is from the truth as far as a proper, healthy Jewish attitude regarding our position in the world, our relationship with Hashem. We believe that we have a covenant with God. We believe that the very fact that our lives are so committed to every detail of Hashem's word as expressed through our actions and through how we act is what gives Hashem a place in this world. Because He is so concerned about every detail with this world, He has given us a very exacting system of sanctification, really, of how we make the world holy and how we bring His light into the world by living according to His word, which is not only just rarefied and abstract spiritual concepts, but very, very real, very physical, things that deal with life and with death and with everything in between. And of course, the temple is the place where all of these things come together with great significance for everyone. So that's why we can appreciate the detail with which our sages view every aspect of life in the time of the temple. But in order to feel that we have a real, proper, thorough, comprehensive understanding of the laws relating to exposure to death, purity, impurity, why it's so, how it works, we're not going to get that today, and it's an entire course of study which is almost limitless. So we've only really covered some basic building blocks and some of the main titles and subtitles in an outline that we would be describing regarding this topic. And of course, regarding this concept of tuma and tahara, purity and impurity, the concept of exposure to death is only one example, albeit a very severe example, of how this works. There are many other areas of everyday life in which these concepts have a great deal of ramifications. So, going on and finishing Halacha Aleph, the Rambam tells us, V'kulo haya mikore stav lifnim mistav. The Rambam's words here, Maimonides' words, are that the entire Temple Mount was roofed, and that there was a double colonnade, a colonnade within a colonnade. And these words actually are explained in the Talmud, in Tractate Brachot, where we have there a elucidation by Rabbi Yehuda, who explains that the Temple Mount was surrounded completely by a double colonnade. And the problem that we have here, actually, is that Maimonides' words seem to imply that the entire area of the Temple Mount was covered with a roof. And this, of course, we know was not the case. We know that one of the purposes that this colonnade served, one of the benefits of this roof, was that it protected those who came to the Temple Mount from the rains. But sometimes the language of the Rambam, as we have seen already, is not clear, and various commentators help to elucidate perhaps some of his meaning. And in this case as well, the proper interpretation, I believe, of the Rambam's expression, V'kulo haya mikore stav lifnim mistav, the entire Temple Mount was roofed by a double colonnade. I believe that the way that we would understand what he's saying is that the entire expanse of the Temple Mount was surrounded, in other words, without a break. There was a continuous roofed structure on the entire area of the Temple Mount. Not that the whole Temple Mount was roofed from start to finish, but that every area of the Temple Mount was surrounded by this roofed structure. And this is basically our understanding of those words. This word, the stav, is the word that refers to this roof structure, this colonnade. Let's see if we just want to add anything about that. It's actually Rashi in Tractate Pesachim who explains that this roof was built to protect the visitors from rainfall. Let's just go on with the time that remains to us now to the second halacha in chapter 5, halacha bet. And now the Rambam begins to describe the gates of the Temple Mount itself. He tells us, V'chamisha sha'arim hayulo. The Temple Mount was accessed through 5 gates. Echad min ha'ma'arav, one from the west, ve'echad min ha'mizrach, one from the east, ve'echad min ha'tzafon, one from the north, u'shnayim min ha'darom, and 2 from the south. So let's look at that again. These are the main gates of the Temple Mount, one from the west, one from the east, one from the north, and 2 from the south. Rochav kol shar eser amot, the width of each gate was 10 amot, v'gavho esrim, and its height was 20, v'yesh lahem delatot, and they have doors. This, of course, is very familiar to us from the previous chapter, where we were learning and discussing in detail regarding the great gate of the temple and the concept of the gate that did not have doors, and that gate which was double the size of the standard gates of the Temple Mount. So what we've learned here so far, again, this is based on a Mishnah, like other aspects of the Rambam. It's the first chapter and the third Mishnah. And what we've seen here is that in each one of the walls of the Temple Mount there was one gate, with the exception of the southern wall, in which there were 2 gates. And if you notice, it's interesting, the Rambam begins his description from the western side, which is the side of the Holy of Holies. And this is, of course, to show reverence to the Holy of Holies. What I want to point out that I think is fascinating is that the Rambam does not mention the names of these gates, even though we do, in fact, know the names of the gates that are mentioned in the Mishnah very specifically. But in Halakha, the Rambam here does not cite, the Mishnah fully does not cite the names of the gates. And this may very well be because the Rambam is writing his halachot forever, for all time, and in the third temple, soon to be rebuilt, perhaps these gates will be given new names, so he felt it unnecessary to record the names of the gates that were in use during the time of the second temple. After all, this is not only a history of what was, it's a blueprint for the future temple as well, the time of the return of the divine presence to the world, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.
Light to the Nations is produced by the Temple Institute, Jerusalem, Israel. Dedications are available for upcoming Light to the Nations teachings. To make a dedication, please visit templeinstitute.org, the multimedia section, Light to the Nations, or email us at temple@temple.org.il. Your dedications help to make these productions possible.